one of the most brutal and ruthless scenes of the Second World War, saw the remains of the former Italian dictator and his mistress being dragged into a square in Milan. Benito Mussolini, the former fascist dictator, had been shot by the roadside near to Lake Como, and then his remains were publicly displayed in front of thousands of angry Italians. Mussolini had taken his nation into the Second World War, and their army performed poorly, and with this thousands of Italians died, and many did not appreciate the fact he allied his nation with Hitler. But the slaughter of Mussolini and the subsequent display of his remains had a huge impact on Adolf Hitler. The Nazi dictator was, when he found out about the death of his friend, in his bunker in Berlin, and he learned what had happened, and with this Hitler took steps to then plan his own demise, and he wanted to make sure that his body was not treated in the same way, and that it did not fall into the hands of his enemies. But Mussolini's remains would then later be buried. However, the coffin was broken into, and the remains of the dictator were then stolen and were hidden. Join us today as we look at opening the coffin of Benito Mussolini, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. At the end of the Second World War, Benito Mussolini was trying to find a way out of Italy, and he was trying to ultimately save his life. He had been placed in control of the Italian Socialist Republic by Hitler, following his freeing from incarceration during the Gran Sasso raid, and Mussolini was joined with his mistress, Clara Petacci. The pair tried to cross the Swiss border, but were denied a number of times, and on the 27th of April 1945, he joined a Luftwaffe convoy, which was heading towards Germany, and Mussolini believed that if he made it to Hitler, then he would be given shelter and protection, or a way out of Europe. But he would never make it to Germany, as the convoy was attacked near to the settlement of Dongo. There were many other fascists travelling with Mussolini, but Mussolini would then be uncovered hiding, and it was said by a partisan who captured him that his face was like wax and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. Following his arrest, it was clear that Mussolini would be executed, as the partisans said that any prominent fascist politician would be condemned, and Radio Milano announced his capture, stating, "The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancour and fear, and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people, so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." But it would be Walter Ordizio who was sent to act as Mussolini's executioner, and he picked up the former dictator and his mistress Petacci, then drove them to the side of the road near to the entrance of the Villa Belmonte, close to Lake Como. The pair were told to get out of the truck, then Ordizio fired a machine gun into the pair, instantly killing them, littering their body with bullets. Following this, Mussolini's body was then taken to Milan, where it was displayed in front of a huge crowd, and his remains were a harrowing image of his fall from grace, and his remains would then be attacked by the crowd, and his body was spat at, kicked, and even urinated on. The crowd were very angry, and his body would then be strung up from a service station upside down in a final act of disgrace, and with this the crowd continued their onslaught until the Americans arrived and then dispersed the crowd. They ordered Mussolini's body to be cut down, then they performed an autopsy on it at a local mortuary. The body was, on the 29th of April at 2 p.m, in the possession of the Americans, and it was the next day that this procedure was performed, and it was found that 7 to 9 bullets had killed Mussolini, and that specifically a cluster of 4 of these, which were found near to his heart, had been fatal. The Americans even took out part of his brain, and kept this for later inspection. But as mentioned, a big effect of Mussolini's death was that Hitler decided that his remains would not fall into the hands of his enemies, and it was said, if he did learn of the full gory tale, it could have done no more than confirm his anxiety to take his own life before it was too late, and to prevent his body from being seized by his enemies. However, after the body had been displayed and the autopsy finished, the question now for the Americans was what to do with Mussolini's remains. It was obvious that for the fascists, they would want to venerate his remains, as to them he was a hero and a martyr, and his body was placed inside of a coffin, which was then secured shut, and the body was then taken to the Musocco cemetery in the north of Milan, and he was then buried quickly inside of an unmarked grave. The coffin was a simple pine coffin, and it had been filled with wooden shavings to soak up any more blood that was on his body. And Mussolini's remains were unrecognisable, with his face heavily swollen and battered by the crowd. He was also not dressed with a shirt on. However, this was not the smartest move burying him where he was, as it was not kept secret where he was buried, and it was obvious to anyone who wanted to find Mussolini's remains where he had been interred. His coffin was a simple one, however it would not be long before this was broken into, and it wasn't long before his body was disturbed. Inside of Italy, the large fascist support that remained would see Mussolini as a godlike figure, and his body was something these people wanted to keep as a relic. But on the anniversary of the Italian liberation from the Nazi forces, a young right-wing journalist with two of his friends decided to open the coffin of Mussolini and then steal his body. Domenico Lesicchi would later become a parliamentary deputy for the neo-fascist Italian social movement, but he would steal the body of Benito Mussolini. Along with two helpers, they went into the Musocco cemetery, and they then dug up the ground with their shovels. Mussolini had been interred for a number of months, but then after they found the coffin, they put it on the back of a truck, and it was then hastily taken away under the cover of darkness. But interestingly, inside the grave where Mussolini had been buried, a note was left saying, "Finally, O Duce, you are with us. We will cover you with roses, but the smell of your virtue will overpower those roses." But the authorities were aware of this, and they knew that they needed to try and find Mussolini's coffin and his body. Still after the Second World War, there were many fascists in Italy, and there were many priests and members of the church who were supporters of Mussolini's cause and ideology, and Lesicchi and his helpers would hide the body of Mussolini inside of a church. They took it to different places and monks helped to move it around different sites, including even in a villa, and then it would be sheltered inside of different churches and monasteries. But then the authorities discovered that the body of Mussolini had been taken to a monastery close to Milan, known as the Certosa di Pavia. When they went into the building, they found the coffin of Mussolini. However, what was bizarre is what happened to part of Mussolini's body. It was clear that his coffin had been broken into and opened a number of times, and this was very evident, as someone had stolen one of the legs of Mussolini from within the coffin, and this is still missing to this day, and it was presumably venerated almost as a relic of a saint or a god. Two friars were arrested and were charged with hiding a body along with Lesicchi. However, there was a new debate now as to what to do with Mussolini's body. The Italian police then decided to continue to shelter and hide it, and they brought the coffin to a Capuchin monastery in the town of Carri Maggiore, and it would remain here for 11 years, with the coffin locked up inside of a cupboard. The location of this was kept secret, and Mussolini's family did not even know where he was buried or where he was, but they did appeal for the returning of Benito Mussolini's coffin to the family crypt, and this would be repatriated years later. On the 1st of September 1957, the coffin of Mussolini and part of his remains and body was taken to the family crypt and was then interred inside of a large tomb. What is disturbing is still today, many people in Italy flock to see his tomb and remains, and he was a man who was brutalised following his execution, to the point that his body was not recognisable. But Mussolini's coffin was opened and broken in a number of times, and even his leg was hacked from his body, and this was then stolen, and his leg is still not been found today. But he's not buried completely, as that leg is still missing. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.